Thank you. We have got a great turnout for the board. Thank you very much. I want to give special regards to the organizers of the event on the board and in the council, mostly notably William Cosgrove, who spearheaded this effort. Thank you very much, Bill. Teresa Carrick of my office that did a lot of the organization and logistics. Teresa may still be out there. And Ms. Sandy Foe, who coordinated the arrangements on the Woodrow Wilson side. Sandy, thanks very much. I also want to note our colleague Mark Chandler's work on the program for this evening, which I hope will provide a little bit of a lasting memento, which promises to be an excellent presentation by Mr. Robert Daly, our featured speaker. I do want to thank the Kissinger Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this event in a truly auspicious venue. Very wonderful. We hope we can come back. Finally, I want to thank our sponsors who are listed on the program. I think it's very fitting that Robert is the director of the Kissinger Institute, for it connects roundly with the legacy of Ambassador Holdridge, for whom this series is named. As I understand it, the ambassador traveled extensively with Secretary Kissinger during the most heady of those times. I wonder a little if these gentlemen and the many others who were at the center of this historic re-engagement of China and the U.S. could have imagined the arc of development that has occurred in the last 40-odd years since normalizations of relationship. I think perhaps they had a little inkling of what was going to happen, but I imagine, too, there are times of occasional doubt. We, who have the privilege of engaging China in the present day, have much to thank for the men and women who worked during those times, bringing these two great nations together. I think we all also who are engaged with China understand there are many unknowns in the continuing development of the relations. However, I firmly believe that the U.S. and the world is better off because of the work of Ambassador Holdridge and his colleagues. Tonight, we're honored to spend some time with members of the Holdridge family, and we are delighted to have Robert give his updated vision of what we may expect from Xi Jinping during his tenure as General Secretary. Before we welcome Robert, I would like to ask Clay Hickson, Chair Emeritus of the Maryland-China Business Council, to share his thoughts and perspectives and introduce our speaker. Clay?
Thanks, Mike. This Holdridge Lecture Series is certainly something that has been very dear to my heart because, as many of you have heard me say, I had a great opportunity to get to know Ambassador Holdridge fairly well over the years. As was noted in his biography in the program, he had written a book about the normalization of relationships between the United States and China. So probably about 15 years ago, MCBC invited Ambassador Holdridge to go up to Baltimore, actually to McCormick's headquarters, to deliver a talk to the council. And I was privileged to drive him up to that event. And then we invited him to join the board, and he graciously accepted. We were very pleased that he did. And because we both live down in Montgomery County, and many of our board meetings were spread from DC up to Baltimore, we had a number of other opportunities to carpool together. And it was always a treat to be able to sit and talk and mostly listen to his great insights and stories about all things U.S.-China stemming from decades before into modern times. And so when he passed a number of years ago, it seemed to be apropos for the Maryland-China Business Council to institute this lecture series. And so we're very pleased that we've been able to continue, and particularly that one of our other board members, Bill, has really helped to organize, and a number of you have helped to organize this event this evening. Similarly, several years ago, actually probably about 6 years ago, I was invited by our speakers organization at the time, the Maryland China Initiative at the University of Maryland, to give a presentation to a group of Chinese. And so our speaker this evening was gracious enough to give me a ride when I couldn't actually drive at the moment. So, turnabout is fair play, I suppose. But our speaker this evening has a very unique perspective on China, having spent many years working in and around China. He produced and was involved in a number of different types of television programs, particularly some Sesame Street and the like programs. He has been a talk show host in China, so that tells you something about his language capabilities as well, and that allows a very significant cultural understanding that might be different from the average American who might be touring in China. He also has spent time working with our government in the U.S. Information Agency, and so he brings significant perspectives that I think will be very useful to us. And then several months ago, some of our fellow board members heard him speak yet again at a forum, and it occurred to us that really that it could not be a more apropos means, as Mike had indicated, of tying this Holdridge lecture series together with U.S.-China history. And so, having said that, we'd like to turn the time over to our featured speaker this evening. Thank you, Robert.
Well, thank you, Clay. I would like to thank the entire Maryland China Business Council, especially Bill, Mike, and Fontaine, for giving me this opportunity today. In particular, would like to thank Martha Holdridge and the Holdridge family. I'm sorry that I never had a chance to know the ambassador, but when I joined the Foreign Service in 1986, his was one of the hallowed names that you heard everywhere, especially in the China service. And having worked quite closely with Ambassador Winston Lord and Ambassador James Lilly, and of course working here now at the Wilson Center, and having worked previously in Nanjing with Stapleton Roy, it is a name that comes up again and again in discussing the history of U.S.-China relations. And for his contribution and for your support of events like this and the Maryland China Business Center, thank you. I'm honored to speak at this event that's being held in his name. In preparing for this talk, I had the thought, which I then realized was ridiculous, that this was a perfect time to take a new look at U.S.-China relations. And the reason I realized that that was a ridiculous thought was because it's now always the perfect time to take a new look at U.S.-China relations. There is so much happening, so much at stake, that we have to keep abreast of events very regularly, even if we don't live in China. If we work with China as you do, in any given week, there are a number of China headlines that need to be analyzed. If we look just at the current week, if we just look at today, for example, I just came from a meeting of the high-level consultation between the United States and China on people-to-people exchanges, hosted by Secretary of State John Kerry and Vice Premier Liu Yandong. And this was a celebration and a promotion of the contributions of state, municipal, and county governments, of educational exchange, cultural exchange, very positive, talking about how these kinds of exchanges can build up mutual trust that we don't have. On the same day, today we had another hearing of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission on Capitol Hill. And with equally good reason, a number of the witnesses there and the commissioners were talking about how we have to pay attention to the growth of China's military, its Navy in particular, and have to attend to what its ambitions might be. The warning is that by 2020, 2030, China might actually have more nuclear submarines and more battleships deployed in the Pacific than we do. And this is, these warnings are put out quite reasonably in sort of dire tones. What does this mean for the United States? Well, there's another connection. What do all of these wonderful people-to-people relations have to do with our fears about the Chinese military? So there's a lot to keep track of. We just had the third plenum, which we're going to talk about a lot tonight. Our Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew, was just in China, and Vice President Biden will be there in a few weeks. So the fact that it's always the perfect time now to talk about China is indicative of precisely how important U.S.-China relations are. It's indicative of how closely we have to watch China, and particularly in this week, as we begin to analyze the third plenum, this really is a key, what people seem to be calling inflection point for China, which is why I've chosen as the title of the talk tonight, "The Right Hand Knows What the Left Hand is Doing." And I chose this title to suggest that one of the ways that we are accustomed to looking at China, namely in terms of right and left, reformers versus conservatives, that this is wrong. The Chinese are, I think, more clear-headed and more united than they have been given credit for by most American analysts over the past several decades. And we have to remember, when you speak of right and left in China, they often mean the opposite of what they mean here. For historical reasons, the rightists are the reformers. The leftists are the old Maoists, conservatives. But you don't need to worry about the confusion because, as I say, this lens, this way of looking at China, I think, is fairly misguided. The important fact for us now, I think, and which the third plenum and the documents that came out of it make clear, is that these right and left arms, reform, conservative heavy hand, all come out of the same body, namely that of Mr. Xi Jinping. And to a considerable degree, he may also reflect the body politic of China, such as it is. We see both a strong desire and probably the institutional ability, the political power to carry out what I tend to believe will be the next round of truly historic and transformative reforms on the political side and in some social areas as well, combined with Xi's left hand, a strong proclivity toward maintaining the Chinese Communist Party's monopoly on political power. This is the prime directive. But the interest in reform based on that is nevertheless sincere. And so when you hear a lot of analysts talking about political reform in China, I think all the evidence suggests that for Xi Jinping, as for Deng Xiaoping, they're not disinterested in political reform. It's just that they believe it was completed in 1949. That was the political reform. It needs to be adjusted, it needs to be updated naturally, but that was the key political move. Economic moves come later. So I don't see any strong conflict, and I see Xi Jinping as having emerged from this plenum exercise at the end of his first year in office, very much as a new strongman, 强人 in Chinese, in the Chinese tradition. I see him as now leading a system which I would characterize, adopting here the Xi and the Chinese point of view, as modern market paternalism. I think this is the way that Xi sees his own leadership. Modern, meaning internationalized, integrated, playing an active role, an increasingly active role in international organizations, very interested in technical expertise and financial expertise. That's the modern piece. Market, increasingly, Xi Jinping clearly wants the market, as he says, to play the decisive role in allocating resources. This is one of the single most important sentences coming out of the plenum. A willingness, stated willingness, for the party to withdraw further from economic decisions in all but the industries that are seen as essential to state security. Now, they tend to define that rather broadly, but still there's a clear desire to move back. And then paternalism. This is going to remain an authoritarian state. Now, we tend to describe China as authoritarian. Some Americans, you'll sometimes hear the word totalitarian thrown around. That's not correct. It's not a correct view of China. But it is very authoritarian. But again, from the Communist Party's point of view, if this authority is necessary for China's development and concern for the Chinese people, then we're more back in the traditional Chinese model of paternalism, benevolent authority. And one of the lines, most important lines in the plenum decision document, which hasn't had enough play in the American press, is that he says, advancing the welfare of the Chinese people is our point of departure and our landing point. This is what this is all about, is increasing the welfare of the Chinese people. And I think that because we tend to be very selective, we look at China in terms of what we hope for it or what we desire to get out of it. We have missed in our reporting on economic and financial reforms and some of the political reforms, we have missed the fact that a great deal of this plenum document, which is really Xi's manifesto and promise, is in fact about social justice in the Chinese context. The word gongping, fairness, public welfare, public goods appears throughout the document, and my sense is that that is sincere, again, from Xi Jinping and the Communist Party's point of view. As Americans, we would probably not welcome this particular brand of benevolence, but in China it has a different flavor. So that's overall where I see Xi Jinping headed, and in saying paternalism, again, that's the Chinese point of view. It doesn't mean that this does not remain an authoritarian state, which is very willing to be brutal when it sees the need. It does see the need, however, in the grand scheme of things with less frequency than it used to. So let's take a quick look at what Xi has done, what I see as his key moves that give us clues to his personality over the past year. And I do think we have to study his personality. We didn't with Hu Jintao. There was no personality to study that either foreign or Chinese observers could really discern. And even in the case of Jiang Zemin, he was first among equals, but he didn't have the amount of personal power and influence that Xi Jinping right now seems to have. Xi, even before he came on the scene, had put himself out as a strong man, a sort of what the Chinese would call a nanzihan, in the north, or macho man in the northern Chinese tradition. This is his persona. He famously, in critiquing the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party, and that lesson looms large for the Communist Party. He does not want to be China's Gorbachev. That is seen as the worst thing that a Chinese leader could be. The collapse of the Soviet Union is a tragedy that is very closely studied. Xi Jinping said in his most famous speech, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union collapsed because nobody in the party was man enough to step up and stop it. 没有一个男儿, for those of you who speak Chinese. And that was clearly saying, I am the man. There's a certain machismo in his presentation. So when Xi, about a year ago, became the head of the Central Military Commission, the president of China, and the Secretary General of the Communist Party, he began by announcing something that he called the China Dream. And this is his phrase that he wants to define or guide his 10-year tenure as the leader of China. And each of them has one. For Hu Jintao, it was harmony. For Jiang Zemin, it was the three represents. For Xi Jinping, it was the China Dream, which he announced, very importantly, at the newly refurbished, at great expense, museum, Chinese museum right there across from Tiananmen, at an exhibit on the long road to the revitalization of China. So the China Dream, of course, this is this extremely vague way of speaking, and I find a lot of the dream discourse that suddenly is flooding out of China actually rather childish in many ways, certainly rather vague, but it's taken very seriously. The dream is a dream of reclaiming China's past glory, of revitalization. And it's often pointed out that what we sometimes speak of as China's rise, from China's point of view, is really a return. It's a reclaiming of its long-standing and natural and rightful place as the civilizational center of the world. People sometimes claim that China is not rising, it's returning. I think that's a little bit misleading because, of course, China now, while its rise has been in its speed and its scope unprecedented in human history and extremely impressive, the fact is it's now rising into a world of sovereign nation states and international norms. And China was never the first state or country among other states. When China was in its periods of greatest glory, this was before the Treaty of Westphalia, before the notion of sovereignty, before international norms. So China's re-emerging under very, very different circumstances than it had absorbed power before. So he announces this dream of revitalizing China with himself as the man, the nanar, or the macho man to do it, against this background of China's rise. China is rising. So what does that mean? We hear the phrase China's rise a good deal. In my view, and people have very different views of this, I think that the ultimate goal of China's rise is a Sinocentric Eastern Hemisphere. I think that China's leaders, and to a large extent China's people, think that a Sinocentric, China as big dog, they wouldn't use the word hegemon of Asia, but this is really what it means, that China at the central of East Asia is a natural, inevitable, and desirable result of all of the energy that we've seen in China. And when the Chinese say that it is a natural result, it means that this is a birthright. This is what China is. China is still what they call Tianxia, or all under heaven. It's the rightful center of East Asia, politically, economically, morally. This is the way that China sees its historical role. Natural, inevitable. No point in resisting, right? Resistance is futile. And I actually think a lot of people in East Asia and even in the Western Hemisphere probably sense that, in fact, this might be so. So how should we respond to this inevitability of a Sinocentric Asia? And desirable. The Chinese government would seem to think that it is perfectly obvious to everybody in the world that China will be a beneficent, a benevolent major power. They seem not to understand the reason that so many of their near neighbors and more distant countries are concerned about China's rise. Because China, like the United States, likes to believe that it is powerful because it is virtuous. It is driven, as is usually the United States, by foundational virtue narratives. And you hear this, of course, in America all the time. You know, we're not rich because we have a strong military. We're rich and have a strong military because we are virtuous. You need not fear American power because we are the good. Right? This is something that we tell ourselves, and I think probably some of us to varying degrees would probably believe that. Well, the Chinese have virtue narratives too, and they believe it. So that, I think, is what China would like to have. Notice too, when we speak of China's rise, because there's a lot of nervousness about this here and in East Asia. To take the Chinese point of view for a minute, China is the first major country to rise where there is no space to accommodate the ambitions of a major rising power. In European rises, they were able to take colonies. Japan was able to take colonies. The United States was able to spread out over a continent, exercise great influence over another continent to the south, and eventually to take colonies as well. China now, with its very late, although very rapid rise, has risen where every single space on the chessboard is occupied. So geographically, China feels no space. China feels no space normatively. The rules are all set. The international laws and the multilateral organizations that are going to make new laws, those are already in place. So geographically and normatively, China senses no space. It also senses no space in what they call the discourse, the Huayuquan, even the way that China wants to describe its rise, the way that it wants to describe the world and multilateralism. That very vocabulary, the terms of that vocabulary, what is acceptable, what are not, are already predetermined. Even as China tries to develop its soft power, the very forms that it uses, dance, film, plays, universities, these are all Western forms. The very forms through which China must exercise its soft power are not forms it invented. It did invent, calligraphy. That's not going to spread around the world, much as I admire it. My home is full of it. I've tried to practice it. I'm hopeless at it. But the Chinese aesthetic forms, those are not going to be the forms by which China exercises soft power. They have to do so by mastering foreign forms. So I think we can have a little sympathy if we think about it from that point of view. There has never been a rise without space. China finds nowhere to go. So she takes over, China Dream, revitalization. He then, over the past year, begins a fairly extensive and effective campaign of repression. They have been rounding up dissidents at a much faster rate. People have been imprisoned for having blogs. There is now a law that says that if something that you tweet, Twitter is actually banned in China, but they have ways of, they have a similar software they can use, that if the tweet you put out there is retweeted 500 times, you've committed a crime. Because you are organizing, you are having influence outside of the Ministry of Propaganda. They have put out the Qi Buzhun, the 7 unspeakables, cutting back on academic freedom, telling academics which subjects they could not speak about in class. So you've seen this great swing back to the left at repression in China for the common people, and then for the Communist Party cadres, we've had campaigns of, we've had anti-corruption campaigns, which I assume you've been reading about. So China Dream sounds very good, very positive. It's China's time again, a return to glory, followed by repression, followed then by Xi Jinping's explication of Chinese history. And if you are the ruler in China, you also have to be something of a philosopher king, even now. This is why we have Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory. This is why you still see Jiang Zemin's calligraphy all over the place. And the way that Xi Jinping wanted to position himself within China is the two undeniables. The Chinese count things like the 两个不可否认. And what he said was, the modern post-1978 reform period in China, you cannot judge it by the standards of pre-1978 Maoist China. And what that means is, to the leftists and the sort of neo-Maoists and the people who don't want market forces, it says that your point of view is irrelevant for judging the past. But he also says, we cannot use the standards of modernizing, reforming China to judge the past. What does this mean? No critiques from a modernist point of view of Maoism. And I, Xi Jinping, am the direct descendant of Mao. It's actually a very clever formulation which would sort of shut up at one stroke people who might come at him from either side. And this was published just this fall before the plenum. Before the plenum, interestingly, again, strong man, very confident. I think he truly is. I don't think this is play acting. I think he really is very confident. He and the other leaders of China did something they very rarely do. They systematically went about raising expectations for the plenum, saying this would be comprehensive, deep, historic, a new revolution, that China was going to change again as it hadn't changed really since Deng Xiaoping started opening up. It's not a typical thing for Chinese leaders to do signaling and to raise expectations. They keep their own counsel. When they're ready to say it, they say it in their own time and manner, and the people can make of it what they will. Xi Jinping is better attuned, I think, to public opinion. He's trying to set up expectations, and then in the plenum itself, he wants to meet them. And this is what's interesting to me, looking at the decision documents. I assume that you've been following to some degree the kinds of things that they're proposing for economic and financial reform. So I don't want to go into a lot of that now. We can talk about it in Q&A if you want. What I find most striking about the plenum is that it really does address the concerns that average Chinese have. There's a great deal in there about decreasing the disparity between rich and poor. Fairness is mentioned, I believe it's 23 times. Fairness in law, fairness in economics, fairness in education, fairness, fairness, fairness. A huge issue for the people at street level in China. There's a great deal in there about the environment, and I'm sure you've read about the terrible air, but not only the poisoned air, the poisoned water, and the poisoned earth in China. The whole country's been poisoned. I was in Beijing for 2 months this summer with my family, and I heard from a number of people in China, both people selling watermelons on the street and very highly connected academics. They said the same thing. They said China's terrible air pollution. And even China's statistics indicate that if you live in northern China, the pollution takes 5.5 years off of your lifespan. And a lot of people I saw in China said, this is a good thing. This is a really good thing. Why? Because the rich and the powerful in China, and they're the same people, increasingly, the rich and the powerful have both politics, political power, and money. They can buy their way out of bad water because they can buy bottled water. They can buy their way out of poisoned food because they can buy imported food. They can buy their way out of the medical crisis because they can go to the best hospitals, and there are very good hospitals in China. They can buy their way out of the educational crisis because they can send their children overseas, but they have to breathe the same air. And so do their children and grandchildren. So maybe this pollution is the lever. And watch very closely, now that November 15th has passed and they've turned on the heat in northern China, watch how the first really terrible airpocalypse gets handled, because a lot of the Chinese people have had it. And again, Xi Jinping knows this. The plenum decision document is full of promises to clean up the environment. The things that he's promising really are the things, in my experience, that the people on the street most want to hear to improve their daily lives. So I believe that he is listening. And if you look also at the documents that have come out of the plenum, and I know plenum is it's kind of a weird word. I think all it means is a meeting of all the most powerful people in China at which major decisions are made. Rhetorically, these documents also end with the China dream. And if we look at them, not as most Americans are looking at them, to try to read between the lines and find out who's up, who's down, who wins, who loses, what directions are they likely to take. If you read these documents as rhetoric, which they are, say these are promises, they're akin in some ways to a State of the Union address, but with more weight and with the people paying far more attention to them. As I read the final paragraphs of these documents, I can sort of hear in the background and see masses of people going, Xi, Xi, Xi. That's how these things are written. It's Xi Jinping. He's made enormous promises to the people and raised very, very high expectations, but very much as a strongman, very much as a nationalist. Now, what are the implications of this and of Xi's style for US-China relations? First, and especially from the point of view of business people, what you're going to be trying to do in China, I think that these reforms are going to be transformative and that they will eventually bring more opportunities for American businesses in China, and that those will be dramatically improved eventually. But it's going to be a wild ride, because these various reforms are going to come out piecemeal. And they will be, as a lot of reforms are in China, they will be experimental. They will do demonstration projects. They will limit certain policies to certain places and certain times. They will then evaluate them. These guys are good long-term planners. They're very smart about this. Their track record in this department is extremely good. Then they may withdraw the policies for a while and revise it, put it back out again. So you're going to have an extremely uncertain legal environment for quite some time. I don't think this will settle down for a new normal for 5 years at the best. And as we're in this very uncertain environment, of course, Chinese, your partners, are going to be in the midst of this as well. And they will be adjusting. They are going to be, the people with whom you're going to be working are going to be guessing about what this really means. Is this sustainable? Will this last? They'll be hedging their bets. They'll be trying to find a way around it. In China, they say, 上有政策,下有对策. The top has its policies, and then we respond to them. So they will, in typical Chinese fashion, be trying to find a way to keep their privileges, even as these new laws come down. They will have a hard time navigating them. You will have to navigate this new investment environment through these partners, and many of them are going to be wrong much of the time. People are going to be placing wrong bets. So we are going to have to attend to changes in China even more closely than we have in the past. I think it's to say about at least 5 years until we start to get a picture of what the new normal is going to look like, even as the Chinese are adjusting to these changes and as the Chinese Communist Party changes its mind. It's not afraid to be consultative. It's not afraid to be experimental. It's not afraid to say, oh, I guess that was wrong. Let's try something else instead. I think this is one of their great strengths, but it can make it very difficult for people who are trying to work with Chinese partners. And you will always find people in China who will tell you that they know. They know. They know the guy who knows the guy. And so you listen to them because they know. And it's a big problem for Americans, not just in business. It's true for universities. It's true for NGOs. Because it's so hard for us to find out what's going on in China, because it remains a black box, we have a very strong motivation to think that the person we know is the person. And usually they're just the person we know. So I think it's going to be a very difficult environment, for at least 5 years. In international affairs, Xi's strongman style, I think, is also going to raise challenges for the United States. He's a strong man. He is very much a nationalist or strong patriot, if you like, depending on how you view the connotations. of those words. And China has very clearly put its markers down as to what, in particular, its territorial claims are. So I talked about China wanting a Sino-centric Asia. What does that mean? The best phrase I've heard to capture what I think China wants, and I can't remember where I heard this first. I can't take credit for it. I think it was the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, somebody there. He said, what China wants is a zone of deference. A zone of deference. We're not talking about China invading other countries, heavy-handed, marching across borders, the People's Liberation Army. No, that's not the style. They don't desire that. But a zone of deference, meaning that anytime any country takes an action in Asia Pacific that is consequential, it has implications for China, that China will expect China's interests to be taken into consideration first. A zone of deference. They see us sort of having a Monroe Doctrine. We don't really get much deference, but that's how they see it. And that is what they think is also their birthright. The Chinese policy to the United States in many regards, and this is going to sound a little bit brusque, within the Western Pacific, if you look at the Chinese statements about what they desire of the United States, they don't say get out of here by any means. In fact, they say that we welcome the United States' continued involvement. The Pacific is a big ocean. It's big enough for both of them. What they do say, in effect, is get out of our way. Do what you want to do, but it can't get in the way of what we want to do, and here's what those things are. And the United States' position is, again, gross simplifications here, broad brushes. We want to continue having our way in East Asia Pacific. Something there is going to have to give, and this is where we have the biggest potential, despite all the wonderful people-to-people exchanges, despite everything that the corporations have achieved, there is a very real potential for conflict between the United States and China in the Western Pacific. Here at the Wilson Center, Ambassador Stapleton Roy says that the biggest threat is that the United States and China's visions of what constitutes stability in the Western Pacific, those are incommensurate. And if we both insist on our current vision of that, then it looks like we are headed for conflict. This is one of the reasons that in 2010 that we announced the pivot to East Asia, which we've now started to call the rebalance. This is, we keep on changing the way that this is rolled out. This is one of the reasons that our model for fighting in the Pacific is now something called air-sea battle. And elements of this have been made public. China, their attitude toward, or their strategy toward America and the Western Pacific is one of what's often called area access denial. They have the land-based missiles that can take out our aircraft carriers, our fighting platforms, if they go in under hostile conditions. We go in all the time now, but if we were to enter into hostilities with China in the Western Pacific. What air-sea battle envisions is taking out those missile batteries before they can fire at our carriers, which is to say it envisions major bombing of the Chinese mainland, and these missile batteries are in population centers. Well, we're not going to bomb Nanjing. We're simply not going to do this. We're not going to do the things that we threaten to do, and so our plan is unconvincing, provocative, but not exactly threatening, because nobody believes, even most people, it's like, as far as I can tell in the United States, that we would actually do this. So we are trying to figure out what our proper response to China should be, and there's been an escalation over the past 2 years. This is why the Chinese proposed, Xi Jinping, what they call a new model of major power relations. And what this is, on China's part, it's very, very vague. The details are to be worked out. We're doing a conference on this here in 2 weeks. But it recognizes this danger of becoming enemies, and it expresses the Chinese desire to avoid that, to avoid what's sometimes called the Thucydides trap. What the Thucydides trap means, people have looked at the 15 major rises in human history when you had a status quo power and rising powers, and in 10 of these cases, they went to war. So this proposed new model of major power relations expresses China's desire to avoid the Thucydides trap, to not go to war. And the United States, as recently as yesterday in Susan Rice's speech, has said, yes, yes, new model of major power relations. We're parroting this, I think, in part because we don't know what else to say. And we share their desire not to go to war, but we haven't really worked out what that is. So that all sounds very negative. There are a lot of positives. There are other strong forces, perhaps stronger forces, that speak against outright conflict. One, obviously, is national interest. Maryland China Business Council knows how much the peoples of the two countries benefit by trade and engagement with each other. And we may be working on a bilateral investment treaty that would strengthen that. Another very strong factor that speaks against United States-China conflicts is multilateralism. When we speak of U.S.-China relations, we often make the mistake of speaking as if these are the only two countries in the world. And when you speak that way, indeed, it sounds like we're probably headed for a confrontation. But of course, we're not. Other countries are rising as well. We have allies, even our allies in Asia-Pacific, who want America to have a stronger presence there, don't want us to fight with China. They want to benefit from relations with both countries. So multilateralism is one of our best defenses, as are the people-to-people and institutional contacts, including the work that corporations and professional associations do. But the difficulty here, as I said at the beginning, is right now, we can talk about all the work that corporations do in our economic interests. We can talk about people-to-people relations, university, and cultural contacts, and the way that these activities increase mutual understanding and build trust between peoples. And all of that is very true, and it's very important. But there's no translation mechanism between those activities, those energies, and those insights, and the geopolitical concerns that have us running war games against each other in the Western Pacific. You can have a program like 100,000 Strong. You can get 100,000 American students to go and become fluent in Chinese. But China still draws a 9-dot line in the Asia Pacific, which says that the whole South China Sea down into and including land, the territorial seas of the Philippines and Vietnam, they say these are our sacred territorial seas and this is a core interest. And America still says, regardless of cultural exchange, mutual understanding, no, it ain't either. So how do we translate between these kinds of concerns? I don't think we know the answer to that yet. As we face these frustrations, there's a consensus, if you read the works of Americans who analyze U.S.-China relations, around two things. One, to have good U.S.-China relations, constructive, not inimical, sustainable, we need to get our own act together here in the United States, politically and economically. Everybody seems to agree on that in both parties. And two, there are calls for better dialogue, more extensive dialogue with China. How are we doing on time? I don't have it here, so I need to look to your watch.
We're about 15 more minutes.
Okay. One of the things that has made doing talks like this difficult, especially for me, I don't wear watches, is that with the advent of cell phones in universities, in classrooms, and think tanks and offices, there are no clocks on the walls anymore. It used to be that there'd be a big analog clock in every single room and you could sort of count on it. And all the clocks have come down as we do this instead. So I apologize.
It's because the students can't read that analog clock anymore.
Yeah. So there are a lot of calls for dialogue, better dialogue between the United States and China. This was what the meeting that President Obama had with Xi Jinping at Sunnylands at the Annenberg Estate in California was about. An attempt to have a more personal, regular dialogue. And I support those calls. I mean, at the Wilson Center, we certainly support that. We're all about international discussion. But there are a couple of really deep cultural constraints on good dialogue. Xi Jinping and Obama, they're never going to be best buds sitting down here. Not for political reasons, but for cultural reasons. What are the cultural constraints on dialogue? There are some big obstacles to this. Yes, we have to have more discussions with China about every aspect of the relationship, military to military, educational issues, cyber, outer space, North Pole, there are all these sorts of issues. The problem is when we sit down with Chinese, and in a minute I'm going to get to what's wrong with the American view too, lest you think that this is just what's wrong with China. I'm going to finish to what I think we need to do. The Chinese tend to fall silent. You know, when we say, okay, China repeatedly says that the post-World War II world order, Bretton Woods, this was all set primarily by the West and the United States to serve its own purposes, and we stack the deck, you know, in our own favor. And now that China, 1/5 of the world, is going to play, they should have a say in making the rules. They shouldn't just be a rule taker. They should also be a rule maker. Well, more and more Americans, I think that's important, that we must give China that voice. It's essential for our own security. We can't insist that they just take wholesale, you know, whatever we've wanted to lay before them. The problem is that when you say to China, okay, what do you want? What do you want? right? 出个主意, tell me what you want. They tend not to say anything. They tend not to say anything. They complain about the lack of normative space and a lack of discursive power. But when given a chance to say something, they don't. I think for several reasons. One, I think part of it is strategic. For China, they believe that silence will, in the end, produce better outcomes for them. Because if they announce too early what their grand vision is, you scare people, and people might start to defend against it. So part of it is I think they think they'll get better outcomes from relative silence. Two, they don't want to scare people. Sometimes Chinese in these discussions are silent, as a Chinese general reminded me once. He said, every time you Americans tell us to be transparent, you think that we're hiding our secret power. Don't you understand that we're hiding weakness? Often silence can hide weakness as well. I think that is sometimes true. It's not as true now as when this general said this to me over 10 years ago. And I think, too, that China is sometimes silent to mask uncertainty. China really doesn't know what it wants in the long term in a step-by-step strategic sense. They say, I think they do want, as a matter of historical and cultural temperament and predisposition, they want a Sinocentric Asia. But I don't mean to imply that China has a master plan for dominating Asia like the Japanese Greater Asia co-prosperity sphere. They really are, as they say, crossing the river by feeling for the stones. They are increasingly confident, but there isn't a master plan, and so silence, again, I think also hides that. China also has a long-standing culture of secrecy and a culture of conformity and deference to whoever the principal is in the meeting. So it's very hard to have the kind of open dialogue that we want. And you've probably been in the situation in negotiations where you have a phalanx of people across the table, but only one interlocutor who speaks, and everybody else defers to that person. And that makes it very hard to have what we think of as a dialogue. And also, one of the other things where we just have a cultural mismatch. When we want a dialogue with the Chinese, we want it to be egalitarian. But theirs is not an egalitarian society. It's hierarchical. We want it to be, we come from a very confessional culture. You want to reveal yourself, and the idea is that creates trust and intimacy, and that they'll reciprocate. But much of the time, from a Chinese point of view, if we're too intimate and too confessional, it's really just kind of vulgar and embarrassing. This is understandable. This response, they don't respond in kind. We tend to want to demonstrate introspection. And I saw this today at this 100,000 strong meeting, where there's a tremendous amount of criticism of the United States and its educational system and everything else we do from Americans. And I think part of this is not wanting to be ugly Americans, wanting to show that we know what our weaknesses are. And part of it, too, and I've been in negotiations of this sort, the idea is that, well, we'll show that we know that we don't do things well, and we'll show that we're comfortable talking about our mistakes. And then they will reciprocate. They'll do the same. They don't. They pocket the concession and move on to the next thing. It's just not, they don't come from a confessional culture. In China, Sigmund Freud, the psychological revolution, hasn't happened yet, for the most part. So we have very different cultures, and China, from the American point of view, won't play at what we think of as a real dialogue, which has to be frank, open, egalitarian, logical, based on a logical argument. Again, not a real tradition in China. If you look at the Analects of Confucius, it's not philosophy. We sometimes call it philosophy, but philosophy in the West means something that is systematic and skeptical. Starts from basic premises and through a logical course of argument builds to a conclusion, and it's skeptical. It questions its premises. China doesn't have a skeptical or argumentative tradition. And so those are areas where the Chinese partners, from the American partners' point of view, tend to fail in dialogue, even when you have strong mutual interests. And even when you have utmost goodwill, as you often do, this goodwill still comes from two different cultural traditions that tend to bang up against each other. Now, what about on the American side? What could we do better? Well, I think that we have also now a lack of clarity about our goals in East Asia Pacific and internationally, and certainly a lack of confidence about our means. Can we afford what we have said we are going to do in the rebalance to East Asia? Suspicions overseas are strong that we cannot, that we don't have the will and we don't have the means. And in America, too, there's a certain degree of uncertainty. We are now also, despite some of our bluster, crossing the river by feeling for the stones, as we would have to be. This is an unprecedented situation. We also, I think it must be said, have a tendency with the Chinese to assume our preeminence, and we tend to lecture the Chinese. We tend to tell the Chinese what they should do. And this doesn't go down terribly well. But and this derives from what I think is our biggest obstacle on our side to dialogue with China. Bill Clinton, a number of years ago, he was talking about the interdependence between the United States and China. And he used the analogy of marriage. He said, China and America, we are married, and there's no option of divorce. Divorce is not an option. We're all Catholics now. Clinton didn't say that, I say that. That's the situation. Is we're married to China, and we cannot get divorced. And what he meant by that is if you're in that situation, there are certain lines you don't cross. There are certain things you don't say. So continuing on that with the marriage analogy to U.S.-China relations, which is of limited utility. I don't propose that as applicable across the board. You may know the work of John Gottman. He's Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Washington. And what he's very famous for is a series of studies in which he interviews newlyweds, and he predicts the outcomes of their marriage and claims to have 90% accuracy in predicting success and in predicting divorce. And Gottman's studies, and there are people who question Gottman, he says the single biggest outcome of the failure of a marriage, the single biggest indicator of a failed marriage, even for newlyweds, in these conversations, you'd have them talk about their marriage, their beliefs, their desires. The single biggest, surest indicator that they were headed for divorce was any hint in the newlyweds' discussion of contempt. Contempt for the spouse is the greatest indicator of divorce. And that contempt is what the Chinese feel in many of the American representations and dialogues with China at a fundamental civilizational level. Even when we are in friendly negotiations with party people, and even in whether it's government or whether it's in businesses, they're more or less party people. They know, we can argue about whether they're right or not, but they know that in fact we have contempt for their form of government. We look down on it, we think it's brutal and inhumane, we don't respect it, and we want it to change. And I think that even for some of the most enlightened and internationalist of us, that's probably true. Even if there are many Chinese that we know and love and things that we want to do with them, at the civilizational level, we're in a position where the Chinese feel we have a fundamental contempt for their form of government. How can they trust us? How can they trust us under those circumstances? And how can we overcome that contempt when it's not just based on misunderstanding? We've got a real fundamental divergence at the level of values in these fundamental choices now, and they're deeply aware of that. And so we are in this position from the Chinese point of view in these negotiations of sort of patting them on the back and punching them in the ribs at the same time. And so they're going like this, and they don't like it, right? And this is very understandable, but how can we break out of that? Of course they don't trust us. And again, here I would have to say the Chinese are mostly correct. If you look at U.S.-China relations for the past 30 years, China, when it criticizes the United States, it criticizes the United States primarily because of our actions. It criticizes the United States for what it does. But we criticize China for what it is. Very, very different, right? And deeply offensive. It's easy enough to see, I think, why the Chinese would have that response and why that would undermine so many of these dialogues. Now, the difficulty that I see China now facing has to do with this distinction between is and does. China wants to be a superpower. Some would say that it already is. Well, one of the characteristics of a superpower, if you are a superpower, this distinction between what you do and what you are tends to disappear. Because other nations experience what you are culturally as something that is inflicted on them. As people in the Middle East, they experience, American mass culture really does, from their point of view, violate and pollute their most sacred beliefs. Do we do this on purpose? No, it's a function of what we are, but they experience it as something that we do. And China is now running into this. In Africa and Southeast Asia, the nature of what China is has a direct impact on other countries, and China has not yet internalized and accepted this. China still wants to claim, in effect with America, my actions can only be fairly judged by my intentions as described by me. But I may judge your actions not by your intentions, but by the effects of your actions as I experience them. And it thinks it can do this because of its experience of being humiliated, because it is the weaker power. So that is why I think that while we do have to have better dialogues, even the obstacles to doing that culturally, with goodwill and with mutual interest, are very high, and we need to recognize them. Simply having Xi and Obama meet together more regularly, I would strongly suspect that they will discover that they like each other less and less, if I had to guess, for these reasons. So with China, I think we need to focus on areas of mutual concern in discussions, and especially given all these constraints, what's the best possible path? I think that in talking to China, we need to focus our dialogues on areas where norms have not yet been established and where China can play as an equal. Now, there aren't many geographical areas where this is true. The Arctic is perhaps one of them. The other geographical area where norms are not yet really established is in outer space. Exploration, exploitation, weaponization. What are the rules? This is something we can deal with China on as equals. It will tend to remove some of the burdens of history here, and we have to work on making rules together with China. And then most of the frontiers that we face now, where there aren't set rules, where China doesn't feel like all the norms have been set, lies in technology. It's new technologies that bring us new frontiers, whether it's cyber or nanotechnologies, the human genome. I think we can focus here in a very constructive way with China so that it can be a rule maker with us and not just a rule taker. Otherwise, we are going to have what the Chinese call a dialogue between chickens and ducks. This is the dialogue of the deaf. We're talking past each other. 鸡同鸭讲, and it simply won't work. I hope this hasn't sounded too pessimistic. I am ultimately not a pessimist. I've been working in U.S.-China relations now for, 25 years, because I think that not only are they fascinating, but they're also ultimately hopeful. But I think we have to get it right and recognize the difficulties if this is going to work out for both nations. And there I will stop. Thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to your questions and answers.
Well, is this thing on? Yeah. Thank you, Robert, very much. I really appreciate the analogy of a marriage, particularly jitong yaja. Sometimes it's like that. But some of the things that I took away briefly is you talk about an inflection point and sort of the gap between their desire to return to their former glory and this new world into which they're being born into.
Right.
And just a couple of comments on that. It sounds like with the zone of deference that they want to return to a pseudo tribute system. Perhaps it played out in their dynastic periods. I would also say that one of the things in our business, you talk about normatization or norms or standards and making rules, is just recently the first Chinese national was elected the president of the International Standards Organization. So I think a sea change that they realize that they want to have to engage in making new rules. And I think it's going to be very interesting as they find their way through taking up what doesn't appear to be much more geography as a way to expand, but they're getting into and have gotten into many new markets. They've taken over on these markets. So just a few takeaways, and I want to open up the forum for questions for Robert.
Or comments, other views.
Yeah, Robert, thank you. Thanks very much for a very informative and illuminating discussion. And I agree with your general analysis of the plenum document, which I think is very important. I'm not quite as pessimistic. I'd like to ask the following question. It seems that the Chinese, although they do have a certain, if you want to call it machismo, they're very proud of where they have come, and they feel that they're very proud of where they think they're going. But there's also certain reticence on their part. The Chinese have seen themselves as a regional power, but have never seen themselves as a world power. And now they're being placed in a position that they are more and more a world power. And they're not exactly sure what that means.
Right.
And when you talk to people, sometimes they will say, we don't want to be the #1 power because it's too expensive, it's too difficult. You be that, we'll be #2 or maybe something else. But they aren't inclined to try and become hegemons in that sense. But they do feel that the relationship with the United States is their most important relationship. And the fact that they have agreed and have wanted this idea of a major relationship, I think, is important and gives us a certain amount of leverage. Because if we can play that card right, then we establish a relationship with China that they also feel is extremely important for their own benefit.
Right.
President Clinton also said, I remember many years ago, when he was asked, what's China going to be like 50 years from now? He always says that depends on what we do in the next year, in the next 2 years, the next 3 years, together with China. That becomes a factor in that.
Right.
And I think that's a little, that will influence a lot what China actually becomes at this point. And so I'm not quite as pessimistic because I think to a certain extent what we do can really determine the relationship with China. The second thing I'd just like to mention is that we are no longer the economic power that we have been in the post-World War II period.
Right.
I think we could again become that if we do the right things here in the United States. And I think the fact that we're not that puts us in a position of something of a paper tiger, so that those people who feel that maybe they're going to replace the United States have some kind of a basis. Whereas if our economy were much stronger, if we came in with a lot more confidence and a lot more backing in that, our relationship with China would be much different. And I think sometimes we have to look more at home, what we have to do here to strengthen ourselves so that we can deal with China effectively.
I wouldn't, yes, and I didn't, I guess I didn't mean to sound pessimistic, but I can see why it might have come across that way. I did want to highlight the fact that despite our growing number of interests, and in many ways, by most measures, by things that are measurable, U.S.-China relations are pretty strong and getting stronger. But we have to keep track of the fact that there is a real danger of conflict, especially in the Western Pacific, and we don't yet know the way out of that. And we also do, although we've gotten out of the habit of talking about it regularly, there are really very deep differences in values, approaches to the human project that limit how close we can get to China. And that remains true, particularly with the kinds of crackdowns that we've seen over the past year and may continue to see. And I think that we need to acknowledge those things even as we do build up all the other kinds of contexts that we're building and that I'm very supportive of. And I think, again, in the long run, I'm not pessimistic, but in truth, that is premised on knowing that China is changing fast and hoping that China will continue to change and that it will become more humane and more open. Now, we're changing too. We have to change as well. I didn't mean to suggest the onus is only on China. It's on us as well. But I think that when I feel sort of ultimately more hopeful, it's because of faith in the Chinese people and knowledge of what they could do if they were freer, and sort of hopes that China will gradually change, not to become more like us, but to let the Chinese more freely and fully become what they want to be. But that, as I say, is experienced by our partners now as a form of contempt and as a plan ultimately at regime change or peaceful evolution, and that's a bit of a tricky wicket as well. So I'm not ultimately pessimistic. I just think it's very difficult.
I was wondering if you could comment about the concept of the Sinocentric Asia principle that you talked about with respect to what's reported to be the paltry age in response to the typhoon in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think China is in a fairly fierce dispute with the Philippines. I wish I should have had a map of the South China Sea here, but this 9-dash line, what China claims as its sacred territory, carves big chunks out of the special economic zones that the Philippines and other countries have under the United States Convention on the Law of the Sea. And China has actually set up structures and in some cases occupied and chased Philippine fishermen away from some of these zones. And the Philippines has sued China before international bodies to get a judgment on China's claims. China is not participating in the suit, it's ignoring it, but they know that a judgment is going to come down, and it may very well be a judgment against China. And so China has had their relations with the Philippines have been getting much worse over the past several years. China did realize a little bit belatedly that it should have been more generous with the Philippines. And so those initial reports that it was only giving $100,000, those are now outdated. And China, in precisely this kind of way, China does learn. As you mentioned, they're getting used to the fact that they're a major power. It's understandable that there's going to be a long learning process of about what that means. The Chinese people are not ungenerous. During the tsunami in Southeast Asia, that was really a watershed for China, where all over China, people, including poor people, were deeply moved and gave a good deal of money. China is building its capacity. In fact, we just had a joint exercise between the American and Chinese militaries on the shores of Hawaii, a joint amphibious landing, working together on emergency aid and relief, this sort of thing. So yes, China rather clumsily seemed very petty, and they seemed to be driven initially by spite rather than by empathy. But I think they've already learned from that. It's already changing. And with a lot of these disaster programs, as with Haiti, the real question is not how much aid gets pledged initially, it's how long is it sustained over several years, and do they keep it up? So China has opportunities to make up for the error, and I think they probably will. I think the message came across, not because we criticized them, but because a lot of Chinese voices within China said, no, this isn't who we are, this isn't the way we play. And so they are adjusting. They learn very, very fast, for the most part. Yes, Fontaine.
Do you think that classical Lenin Marxist thought still plays a role in the upper echelons of Chinese political thinking and social thinking? And if so, what would they be looking at as the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in the current world situation?
I think that, in fact, Marxism and Leninism play very little role in the belief system of people within the Communist Party. But they can't throw it out either, because if they need to draw a direct line for themselves back to Mao Zedong. If they are not the direct ideological descendants of Mao, then why are you in power? It's a question of legitimacy. So they cannot disown the past formally. That is why in the plenum documents they say that one of China's most fundamental truths is that it is still and will for a long time be in the primary stages of socialism. So this is, I won't get into the details of why you need to do that in terms of Marxist-Leninist theory, but it's a way of tying back to the thesis, antithesis, synthesis mode of thinking and giving themselves cover while they then go on to do the things they want to do, which is to increase the standard of living of the Chinese people, increase their national power. And those get talked about a lot. The Orville Schell's new book is called Wealth and Power, that what China wants is a wealthy, strong nation. What I think has to be added to that gets missed in America, is they also very much want to increase the welfare of the Chinese people as they understand it. That doesn't include kinds of individual liberties that we think are very important, but it includes other measures of welfare. They are genuinely interested in better governance, in being more representative, in listening, in providing better medical care, better education, better housing, better job opportunities. And I think that our reporting on China tends to imply, even if it never quite says, that the Chinese government either doesn't know or doesn't care. It does know, it does care, and that's very clear if you read the plenum documents in their entirety. I think we have a selection bias because we read these documents saying, well, what opportunities do we have for our business? The one-child policy, we sort of understand that, so we focus on that, those changes. What are the economic changes going to be? But an awful lot of what is in there, if we can get rid of selection bias, is, I think, true, genuine concern for the welfare of the Chinese people as they understand it. We miss that. But no, not Marxism, Leninism. It's not a guiding thought system now. Hasn't been.
One of my good friends over there is also a good communist, and he goes to commie school every couple of years, and they relearn this stuff. And I said, Peter, what's the conflict now between capitalism and socialism? He said, well, Mike, we know we didn't do it right before, but now we're trying to increase our wealth so we can do socialism better.
Right, right. Well, this course is infinitely flexible, this stuff.
Thank you again for giving this fascinating talk in the name of my father. It's a real honor. I have a question about the comments you made about the plenum outcomes and the talk about promising to clean up the environment. Do you think they can deliver on that? And I have a second part of that question, which is what is the Chinese government's official policy and view of the threat of global climate change, and what are they prepared to do about it?
Right. Second one first, climate change is recognized as a major problem. There's a lot of conspiracy theorists in China as here, and so there are a lot of climate change deniers as well, but that is not the stance of the government. They take it very, very seriously, but they take economic development more seriously. They need to continue to increase standards of living for their people, both because many Chinese remain too poor, and also because that is the promise that the Communist Party has made. That's the foundation of its legitimacy. And so economic development continues to trump environmental concerns, but it doesn't mean that the environmental concerns aren't genuine. So China has a minimal carbon trading system. They have announced far more aggressive goals than we have for decreasing the carbon intensity of GDP, and the indications are that they take that very seriously. And they are also very aggressively trying to reduce the amount of coal input as a matter of their total energy output. And they have some serious goals for that. And they're very aggressive along those lines. And they're developing wind, they're developing solar. The coal that they do burn is generally very low quality, soft, high sulfur coal. So it's highly polluting. The problem China faces now is, if you extrapolate its current, even lower projected rates of growth. And even if you can greatly reduce the coal input to each unit of GDP output, because the total amount of GDP is going up so fast, even if they meet their goals, they're still burning more coal. And one of the things they would say to that, and this gets to U.S.-China relations, is, you, Western Europe, everybody else, you went through your industrial revolution, you polluted your own environment, you've recovered, don't get religion so late in the day and condemn us to poverty. To which we tend to say, yes, but we've learned, you can learn from our experience, and there are new technologies, scrubbers and these other things, and their response is, okay, well, give them to us for free if it's so important. We go around and around and around on this, but the basic idea is that China is now the world's biggest source of greenhouse gas, but that's recent. They're not the biggest supplier of all the greenhouse gas that's already up there. That's us. They will say they showed up at the banquet, ate dessert, and were handed the bill. So is this an area in which we can take a little more leadership? I mean, it would seem to me, and now whether do they have a good point or not? Well, they have a good point historically, but the historical justice of their case is irrelevant if a lot of the warnings about the disastrous effects of climate change are correct. Then it has nothing to do with historic justice. It has to do with stopping now. It doesn't matter who's doing it.
Yeah, when your population all lives close to the coast.
That's right. And we've also got India. I mean, there are other people coming. And so, but this is the nature of the discussion. They tend to see it, they take it seriously. They're making serious moves. Economic development is more important. They think that we should lead because we did most of the polluting. And we want to say historical justice doesn't really matter. What matters is solving this now, or we're all in trouble.
Well, I watched the president's science advisor getting beaten up by Congress for even talking to the Chinese. They cut his budget because he did.
Right. And we have to talk to the Chinese. This is we have to work with them very closely on all of these issues: epidemiology, public health, environmental issues. And yes, we have people in Congress who think that any kind of cooperation with the Chinese is a deal with the devil.
Right.
And here?
Okay, The comment that you made about that China has no room to grow, that the structure, the framework by which their ascendancy to peerage or collegial in the power dynamic. I would suggest that the place of opportunity for growth is actually in the African theater, and that the matter of security, whether food security, water security, even land security that has its implications, might be that place to grow. It's
Right.
very sub rosa for most observers, but I think it's very significant because I think Africa has a different set of needs. I was there during the building of the Tanzanian Railway, so we can go back many years to look at China's presence there, and that presence is even more prominent today. So how do we reconcile the matter of justice making, seeking, or whatever in the African context when China is really, ascending?
Right. Well, China, Africa is one of the places, probably the primary place, although there are others, where China is doing what you suggest, a lot of infrastructure investment, a lot of resource extraction, mostly to date sort of mineral extraction. But as you say, China is also looking for farmland overseas. It's been looking for deals in the Ukraine. But when China has gone into Africa, it's encountered the problems that superpowers encounter. And it has been accused of the things that it has been very happy to accuse America of doing for years, of neocolonialism, of actually exploiting local conditions, of robbing local people of their wealth for low wages, of building Chinatowns and importing Chinese laborers instead of giving jobs to the locals. There has been some racial resentment. China has convened a few years ago in Beijing the biggest group ever of African leaders. I mean, that was a brilliant stroke. It was very effective. It was very good diplomacy. But the difficulty China is now encountering, it has been very proud of the fact that, unlike America, it invests in countries with no conditions attached and without preaching or making requirements about the kinds of governments with which it deals. And so it has gained some contracts and some leverage that America couldn't have for that reason. But now they're also beginning to pay the price for that, which is if you do a deal with a dictator and the dictator falls, where does that leave you? How do the people in that country who are subject to the brutality of the dictator view you?
There we can give some lessons.
Yeah. Right. So there is space there. China is very aggressively and in some ways very intelligently moving into Central Asia, what we sometimes call the stands, again mostly for resources, natural gas and oil, and they're doing so as Russia casts sort of a wary eye. They have been building pipelines and railroads through Southeast Asia, but they're finding, as we do, that they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't, because they go in, and for example, in Southeast Asia, with the rail line to a new port, this could be a boon to all of Southeast Asia. But China, in fact, took most of the jobs for Chinese in all of these places. They didn't spread the wealth around. So they're finding that they're accused of being neo-colonialists in Africa and other places in South America. But I say they do learn. So I would continue to watch very closely Chinese movements in Africa, but after a very successful start, they've been getting considerable blowback in the past few years.
Thank you, Robert, for the lecture. It's wonderful. I'm also interested in your notion of China's desire for the Sino-centric Asia. I want you to explain more on that theme because I want to know your feeling about this thing. Because do you think China is like Russians today, even after the demise of the Soviet Union, they also still want to control the Soviet bloc countries like Ukraine, Belarus?
No. No.
How do you think? Because China and Russia now has a pretty good relationship. How do you think these two countries plus the U.S., how the three countries, develop their
Well,
by a
China and Russia
multilateral.
have, for about the past, well, I guess almost 20 years now, several different times they have, including through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they have very publicly held meetings or made other moves that demonstrated a willingness for the two of them to combine together to sort of counter the United States. And the United States, for the most part, hasn't taken this very seriously. We know that for historical reasons and a whole host of other reasons, China and Russia are not natural allies by any means. They don't get along with each other. They are deeply distrustful of each other. China hasn't brought in the amounts of Russian oil and natural gas that Russia would like to have. Russia is now, in fact, talking to Japan about the Kuril Islands in what would seem to be an attempt to balance China. So there's a lot of balancing and attempted balancing and hedging going on. We can't just focus on a few big countries. We tend to miss the big picture. So China and Russia are not natural allies. I don't see them becoming enemies either, but Washington doesn't, shiver in its boots every time, Putin and the Chinese leader meet again. Yet that's not taken very seriously. I don't see China wanting to replace Russia or to take on the Central European nations or Ukraine as satellites or imprisoned nations as they were under the Soviet Union at all. I don't believe that China has those ambitions. It doesn't have those desires. It's a zone of deference. They want to be respected in Chinese terms, and that means that they want their interests taken into concern first when countries make major moves. I don't mean to imply that said the PLA is going to be marching across borders and invading or controlling other countries. I don't think that China wants to. That's not what I meant to imply.
I think we got time for one more question. Bob, you're the lucky one.
Robert, thank you very much for your discussion. It's much appreciated here, especially as you can see, or if you can guess, I'm a Chinese American. So if you think about the China-U.S. relation is a marriage, so we Chinese Americans are more like the children here. So if they got divorced, then what we do, right? So it's very serious. So thank you for that. So my question has to do with this reform. So could you talk about the opportunities for us from both politically and economically? So the second part of that is you mentioned education, right? So China has to learn to play a more responsive role, right, in the world norms. So do we see an opportunity to maybe better influence the Chinese as a result of this reform?
Well, I think we speak of influencing the Chinese. Looking back over the time that I've been involved with this for about 25 years, almost any time that we have tried to use a specific lever or mechanism to get a specific result from China, we've ended up with egg on our face. We've made a terrible mess. I don't think we have very much direct influence over China. We can't tell them what to do, and it's wrong to try, because when we do, it's offensive and it tends to produce worse results. I think America has had an enormous influence on China over the past 30 years, but it's mostly had that influence as a catalyst. We've had it just by virtue of what we are and the kinds of involvement that we have with China, and I think that we need to get even more deeply engaged with China in order simply to present other options to them, and then to let the Chinese make of those options what they will. So I don't see any American policy that attempts to influence China a particular way is not terribly likely to succeed. Rather than trying to influence China, and of course we want to influence China in all sorts of specific policies. I'm talking more sort of in broad, long-term terms. But I think that we really do need to work with China and other countries on discussing and making new norms and new rules together. I think that we have to be open to that. I think we need to listen and they need to talk. I think that we need to hear criticisms and be willing to make real changes. To date, they haven't been willing to make very concrete suggestions, and one of the reasons is that although they criticize the existing world order in ways that sound plausible some of the time, in fact, they're the biggest beneficiary of the existing world order over the past 30 years. They've played it extremely successfully. And I think increasingly they know that. that they are a beneficiary. Even so, I think that in our bilateral dialogues, the emphasis has to be not on yet another discussion of what we don't like about each other. I read my talking points, you read yours, and we go home until next year's dialogue. We need to talk about where we want to be 10, 20 years from now. What sets of rules or practices or accommodations would work for both of us and for other countries. I would rather try to do that together than have a strategy based on how can we influence China despite all these factors we've described today, because I don't see that kind of approach succeeding. Thank you. I know it's late and you've all worked a long day, and like me, a lot of you are going up to points north in Maryland, so I want to.
Well,
Let you go.
one more round of applause for Robert. Thank you very much. And I know you said you have a lot of calligraphy, and at the risk of putting frosting on a cake, there's you can never have too much neckwear
Oh,
from China.
goodness.
Yes. So I want just a few brief announcements. December 11th is our holiday party at the warm and welcoming house of Bob and Judy Goodwin. So mark your appointments. Bob, thank you very much for hosting once again. At 5:30 will be our board of directors meeting, board of directors people. We will convene at 5:30, and we're also soliciting nominations to the board. So once again, Robert, thank you very much. Thank you to the Wilson Center and the Kissinger Institute, and good night.
Thank all of you.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that. Martha?